The shadow of Iron-Rose, the bayou does not forget. In the Georgia Low Country, the water is black not because of the mud, but because of the history that has settled at the bottom. At Iron-Rose Manor, the history didn't settle, it breathed. It breathed through the weeping cypress trees, through the crumbling brick of the slave quarters, and through the frantic, shallow lungs of Alistair Sterling. They say a man's home is his castle. But for Alistair, Iron-Rose was a cage made of lace and iron, presided over by a warden who stood a head taller than him in every sense of the word. This is not a story of a great man's fall. It is the story of a small man's descent into a darkness so absolute that even the swamp refused to swallow it. Chapter 1. The tall shadow, the grandfather clock in the foyer of Iron-Rose, struck 7. The sound was a rhythmic executioner's axe, marking the arrival of dinner, and with it, the arrival of Alistair's nightly humiliation. Alistair Sterling sat at the end of a mahogany table that could have seated 20. He looked like a child playing at being a king. At 5'4", his feet barely reached the floorboards. His shoulders were narrow, his skin the color of parched parchment, and his eyes, twitchy and dark, were always searching for a corner to hide in. At the other end of the table stood Gwendolyn Sterling. She did not sit. Gwendolyn was a woman of 6'1", a towering monument of silk and cold, aristocratic fury. When she spoke, the wine in Alistair's glass seemed to tremble. "You've been in the accounts again, Alistair," Gwendolyn said, her voice a low, resonant thrum that vibrated in the silver. "And as usual, the math is as weak as the man who performed it." Alistair gripped his fork, his knuckles turning white. "The harvest was lean, Gwendolyn. The blight is in your blood, not the crops," she interrupted, her voice rising like a gathering storm. She walked toward him, her heavy silk skirts rustling with a sound like a sharpening blade. She stopped behind his chair, her shadow stretching over him, extinguishing the candlelight. "You are a small man, Alistair, small in stature, small in mind, and utterly insufficient in spirit. If my father hadn't signed this land to me, you'd be sweeping the streets of Savannah." She leaned down, her face inches from his. She smelled of cold lavender and iron. "Look at me when I speak to you." Alistair forced his eyes up, but his gaze didn't stay on Gwendolyn. It flickered, for just a heartbeat, toward the sideboard where Zola Marrow stood. Zola was 20, her skin the color of midnight river silt, her presence a silent fire. To Alistair, she was more than a servant. She was the focal point of a fever. He was a nymphomaniac, possessed by a dark, insatiable hunger for the women of the Marrow line. It was a racial fetish fueled by his own emasculation. He wanted to dominate the one thing Gwendolyn could never be, the women he viewed as the other. Gwendolyn noticed the flicker. She didn't feel jealousy. She felt a searing, clinical disgust. "Get out," she snapped at Zola. "And you, Alistair, go to your study. I will balance the ledgers myself. I have no time for the wandering eyes of a failure." Alistair scrambled from his seat, his boots clicking pathetically on the hardwood. As he retreated, the seeds of a dark plan, voodoo seeds planted by a swamp doctor months ago, began to sprout in the heat of his shame. Chapter 2. The Whisper of the Borgney. The Georgia moon was a sliver of bone. Alistair didn't go to his study. He slipped through the servants' entrance and into the humid embrace of the swamp. He walked until the sounds of the manor were replaced by the wet, rhythmic pulse of the bayou. Deep in the cypress knees, where the moss hung like the hair of the drowned, he found the shack. Old man Borgney sat by a fire that burned a sickly, chemical green. He was a practitioner of the left-hand path, a man who bartered in the bits of soul that men were willing to sell for a moment of power. "You come seeking the still life, little master." Borgney's voice was a wet rattle. "I want them silent," Alistair hissed, his small frame shaking with a mix of fear and lust. "I want to be the master. I want Zola and her sisters." And every woman who looks through me like I'm a ghost, I want them frozen. I want them to be mine, and I want them to never, ever be able to say no. Borgny reached into a jar and pulled out a lump of red clay mixed with powdered bone and human hair. This is the binding salt. You sprinkle it in their path. You whisper the name. You pierce the doll with a silver needle. Their spirit will be tethered to the clay. Their body will remain a living statue, conscious of everything you do, but unable to move a finger. Alistair reached for the salt, his eyes wide with a predatory light. Careful, little master, Borgny warned. A soul held in a jar becomes a poison, and a nymphomaniac with a god complex is a man who invites a very tall shadow to fall upon him. Alistair didn't listen. He clutched the salt to his chest and ran back toward Iron-Rose, his mind already building the cellar harem he had dreamed of for years. Chapter 3. The Still Life of Zola Marrow. The first time was the sweetest. Elias found Zola in the drying shed 3 days later. The air was heavy with the scent of tobacco. Zola was reaching for a high rack, her back turned to him. "Zola," Alistair whispered. She turned, her expression wary. "Master Alistair." "Mistress Gwendolen," said. He didn't let her finish. He flung the binding salt into her face. It didn't fall. It hung in the air like a cloud of glowing gnats before rushing into her lungs. Zola's eyes went wide. She tried to scream, but her jaw locked. Her arms stayed raised mid-reach. She was a statue of flesh and amber eyes. Alistair walked a slow, shivering circle around her. He stood on a crate so he could look down at her. "Do you see me now, Zola?" he whispered, his fingers tracing the line of her throat. "No more walking away. No more looking at Gwendolen for orders. You are the first piece of my collection." That night, he led her down into the cellar, a sound-proofed vault he had spent weeks preparing. It was draped in red silk and lit by black tallow candles. He placed her against the wall, her wide eyes reflecting the flickering flames. The nymphomaniac in him was finally fed. But the more he ate, the hungrier he became. Chapter 4. The Harvest of Shadows. The addiction did not start with a roar. It started with a whisper, the sound of a silver needle piercing red clay. After Zola Marrow was safely tucked away in the silken dark of the cellar, Alistair felt a change in his very marrow. The fear that usually sat like a cold stone in his stomach was replaced by a humming, electric heat. When he looked at Gwendolen across the breakfast table, he no longer saw a giant. He saw a nuisance, a temporary obstacle to the true business of his life. But a collection is not a collection with only one piece. "Where is Zola?" Gwendolen asked one Tuesday morning, her voice slicing through the steam of her Earl Grey tea. "She hasn't reported for the laundry in 2 days. The girl is lazy, Alistair, just like the rest of them." Alistair didn't flinch. He carefully spread marmalade on his toast, his small hands unusually steady. "I sent her to the far quarters, Gwendolen, to assist the midwife. There's a fever spreading among the pickers. I thought it best to keep the infection away from the main house." Gwendolen's eyes narrowed, her sharp, hawk-like gaze searching his face for a lie. But Alistair had become a master of the mask. "Efficient," she remarked, though her tone suggested she found the very word alien to his character. "See that she returns by Friday. I want the linens bleached." Alistair nodded, but in his mind he was already at the wash-house. He wasn't thinking of linens. He was thinking of Cora Marrow, Zola's older sister. Cora was sturdier, her defiance more vocal, her eyes always tracking Alistair with a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. He wanted that loathing. He wanted to see it freeze. That evening, as the sun dipped below the swampline, turning the water into a pool of spilled wine, Alistair found Cora near the boiling vats. The air was thick with the smell of lye and wood smoke. "Mistress says Zola's sick," Cora said, not bothering to look up as Alistair approached. She stirred the heavy vat with a long wooden pole, her muscles rippling under her thin cotton dress. But the midwife says she ain't seen her. Where's my sister, Master Sterling? She's where she needs to be, Cora, Alistair whispered. He felt the familiar surge of nymphomaniac hunger, the sick, driving need to possess the one thing that dared to defy him. You're lying, Cora spat, finally turning to face him. She stood half a head taller than him, her shadow looming over his small frame. You've got a rot in you, Alistair. I can smell it. Then smell this, Alistair hissed. He threw the binding salt. It hit the steam of the laundry vats, turning into a shimmering, opalescent fog. Cora coughed, her hand flying to her mouth. She tried to swing the wooden pole to strike the small man before her, but the magic was faster than her rage. Her muscles locked mid-swing. The pole clattered to the stones, but Cora remained upright, her body a rigid pillar of frozen fury. Her eyes, dark, intelligent, and now wide with a dawning horror, stared into his. "Two," Alistair breathed. He didn't lead her to the cellar immediately. He spent an hour just standing there, in the fading light, watching her try to breathe. He touched the pulse in her neck, feeling the frantic, trapped beat of her heart against his thumb. He felt like a giant. He felt like a god. By midnight, Cora was standing next to Zola in the red silk vault. Two sisters, two living dolls. And Alistair sat in the center of the room, lit by black candles, breathing in the scent of their terror like it was the finest perfume in Georgia. Chapter 5. The T-Bon Ange. To the world, Zola and Cora Marrow were missing. To Alistair, they were the only things that were real. But to the women themselves, the world had become a waking coffin. The voodoo curse of the still life did not dull the senses. It sharpened them until they bled. Zola could feel every speck of dust that settled on her skin. She could feel the slow, agonizing crawl of a spider across her collarbone, its hairy legs a torture she could not swat away. She could hear the wet, heavy breathing of Alistair Sterling as he sat in the dark, watching them for hours on end. But the worst was the T-Bon Ange, the little good angel, the part of the soul that Alistair had tethered to the red clay dolls in his silver trunk. Zola's consciousness felt like a bird trapped in a glass jar. She could see out, she could feel out, but she was disconnected from the machinery of her own body. When Alistair touched her, when his small, clammy hands moved across her skin in his late-night fits of nymphomaniac obsession, she wanted to scream until the manor crumbled. She wanted to claw his eyes out. Instead, she did nothing. She was a statue, a silent witness to her own violation. She watched as her sister Cora was brought in. She saw the fire in Cora's eyes, the same fire she had felt, and she watched as it slowly began to drown in the darkness of the cellar. They couldn't speak to each other, couldn't comfort each other. They were just two pieces of a collection, being curated by a man who was losing his mind to the power of the salt. "You look so peaceful, Zola," Alistair would whisper, his face inches from hers. He would use a silk cloth to wipe a stray tear from her eye, the only movement her body was capable of. "Gwendolyn shouts. Gwendolyn demands. But you just listen. You're the perfect wife, aren't you?" Then he would turn to the dolls in the trunk. He would adjust the silver pins, and Zola would feel a sharp, stabbing pain in her joints, a reminder that her soul was no longer her own. In the quarters, the Marrow family was beginning to moan. Hester and me, the younger sisters, were looking into the swamp, calling their names. They didn't know that the master was listening. They didn't know that every cry they uttered was just another invitation for Alistair to expand his gallery. Chapter 6. The Scent of the Iron-Rose. While Alistair descended into his silk-lined hell, Gwendolyn Sterling began to smell the rot. Gwendolyn was a woman of the earth and the ledger. She believed in things she could count and things she could command. But Iron-Rose was beginning to defy her. It started with the flowers. The prize roses that gave the manor its name began to turn black at the edges, their scent replaced by a cloying, metallic sweetness that reminded Gwendolen of an open vein. Then came the mirrors. Every morning, she would find the mirrors in her bedchamber clouded with a gray, greasy film that no amount of vinegar could scrub away. "Alistair," she said one evening, stopping him as he tried to slip away to his study. The sun had set, and the shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch toward him like questing fingers. He froze, his hand on the doorframe. "Yes, Gwendolen." She walked toward him, her height making her look like a vengeful tower in the gloom. She didn't stop until she was inches away, her sharp nose sniffing the air around him. "You smell of jasmine," she said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, low register. "And sulfur, and something." Unwashed, Alistair's pulse hammered in his ears, a frantic drumbeat. I was in the smokehouse, Gwendolen, checking the hams." "The hams," she repeated, her eyes boring into his. She reached out and gripped his chin, her fingers like iron pincers. She forced him to look up at her. "There is a silence in this house, Alistair, not the silence of peace, but the silence of a held breath. The Marrow women are vanishing. First Zola, now Cora. The overseers say they've run to the swamp, but no one runs to the swamp without a bag and a pair of boots. Their boots are still in the quarters." Alistair tried to pull away, but she held him fast. "I don't care about your dalliances, Alistair. I know you're a weak man with animal urges, but I will not have my labor stolen by the bayou because you are too incompetent to keep the doors locked." "I have everything under control," Alistair hissed, a spark of the voodoo-fueled ego flickering in his eyes. Gwendolen laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "You have nothing under control. You are a small man playing in a large house. If I find you've been hiding them, if I find you've been wasting my property on your sick little games." She let go of his chin with a flick of her wrist, as if she were discarding a piece of trash. "Clean yourself. You look like a man who has been digging in the dirt, and stay out of the cellar. I've noticed the lock has been changed. I expect the new key on my vanity by morning." She swept past him, her silk skirts sounding like a warning hiss. Alistair stood in the dark, his heart cold. He couldn't give her the key. If she saw the silk, if she saw the candles, if she saw the marrows, she wouldn't just kill him. She would destroy his masterpiece. He looked at the floorboards, imagining the women standing just a few feet below his boots. He needed more salt. He needed more pins. And he needed to make sure Gwendolen Sterling never walked down those stairs. The master thinks he is the hunter. He thinks the silver needles make him a king. But at Iron-Rose, the walls have eyes, and the tall mistress has a nose for blood. The collection is growing, yes, but so is the debt. And the bayou always collects its interest in screams. Chapter 7. The third knot. Alistair Sterling did not sleep. Sleep was for men who weren't gods. He sat in his study, the door bolted from the inside, a single candle guttering on his desk. In front of him lay the silver-lined trunk. Inside, the red clay dolls of Zola and Cora Marrow lay side by side. He touched them with the tips of his fingers, feeling the faint, unnatural warmth of the spirits trapped within. His nymphomania was no longer a quiet hunger. It was a screaming void. The presence of the two sisters in the cellar wasn't enough. The voodoo power had acted like oil on a fire, turning his racial fetishization into a fever that demanded more. He needed the full set. He needed the entire Marrow line to be still under his hand. "Hester," he whispered, the name tasting like copper. Hester Marrow was the youngest, barely 18, with a voice that could carry across the fields like a songbird. She was the light of the Marrow family, the one who kept the hope alive in the quarters. To Alistair, she was the ultimate prize, the one whose spirit would be the hardest to break, and therefore the most delicious to own. He didn't wait for the sun to go down. He moved through the house like a rat in the wainscoting, avoiding Gwendolen's towering presence. He found Hester near the well, drawing water for the evening meal. The quarters were empty, the men still in the fields, the air humming with the first heat of the evening. "Master Alistair?" Hester asked, her eyes widening as he stepped out from behind the weeping willow. She noticed his eyes, bloodshot, frantic, the pupils dilated until they swallowed the amber of his iris. "You look unwell, sir. Shall I fetch the mistress?" "The mistress is busy, Hester," Alistair said, his voice a jagged rasp. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silken pouch. "But you have a song in your throat. I think it's time we put it in a jar." Hester saw the gray dust in his palm. She had heard the whispers in the quarters, stories of a shadow man who took the breath from your lungs. She turned to run, her skirts catching on the bucket, but Alistair was fueled by a manic, occult energy. He flung the salt. It caught the wind, spiraling into a miniature cyclone of bone dust and sulfur. Hester inhaled, a sharp, terrified gasp, and the world stopped. She didn't fall. She stood by the well, her hand frozen on the rope, her body leaning forward as if to flee a ghost that had already caught her. Her eyes, filled with a sudden, agonizing consciousness, stared at the mossy stones. "3," Alistair giggled, a sound that was more sob than laugh. He didn't care who saw him now. The addiction was too strong. He led the still Hester through the servants' entrance, her feet dragging like lead weights. By the time the moon rose, the third knot was tied. 3 sisters, 3 living statues, standing in the red silk dark of the cellar. And in the room above, Alistair began to prepare the silver needles for the night's ritual. Chapter 8. The tall woman's wager. Gwendolyn Sterling sat in the great hall, her 6'1" frame draped in black lace, looking like a vulture carved from shadow. She didn't need to see the cellar to know what was happening. She could feel it. The house was dying. The Iron-Rose was rotting from the roots up. She stood up, her footsteps heavy and deliberate. She walked to Alistair's study and didn't knock. She kicked the door open, the heavy oak splintering against the wall. Alistair jumped, nearly knocking over the candle. He scrambled to close the silver-lined trunk, his small hands fumbling with the latch. "The key, Alistair," Gwendolyn said. Her voice was a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate the very marrow of his bones. She didn't move toward him. She simply stood in the doorway, her height making the ceiling seem to press down on his head. "The key to the cellar." "Now I lost it, Gwendolyn," Alistair stammered, his eyes darting toward the silver trunk. "The lock is jammed. I'll have the blacksmith look at it in the morning." "You lie like a dog, and you smell like a grave," Gwendolyn said. She walked toward him, her shadow stretching across the desk, extinguishing the light of his single candle. She reached down and gripped his collar, lifting him until his toes barely touched the floor. "I know about your hobby, Alistair. I know about the Marrow girls. I thought you were just a common lecher, a man who couldn't keep his hands off the help. But this smell, this is old magic. This is filth." Alistair's fear was suddenly eclipsed by a spike of nymphomaniac rage. He reached into his vest and pulled out a small vial of commanding dust, a more potent version of the salt meant to break even the strongest will. "You want the key," Alistair hissed, his face inches from hers. "Here's the key." He blew the dust directly into Gwendolyn's face. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. Alistair waited for her to freeze. He waited for her to become the 4th statue in his collection, the ultimate prize, the giantess brought to her knees. But Gwendolyn didn't freeze. She coughed, a sharp, barking sound, and wiped the dust from her eyes with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. Her spirit was too large, her dominance too rooted in the physical world for the petty magic of a small man to take hold. She gripped his throat with her other hand, her fingers like iron bands. "You think you can bind me with your swamp tricks," she whispered, her voice a terrifying growl. "I am the Sterling of Iron-Rose. I am the land. You are nothing but the dirt that clings to my boot." She flung him across the room. Alistair hit the bookshelves, a dozen ledgers raining down on his head. Gwendolyn didn't look back. She looked at the silver trunk. "I will find your toys, Alistair," she said, her voice echoing in the hallway. "And when I do, I will show you what a true master does with a broken instrument." Chapter 9. The Song of the Marrows in the Cellar. The air was cold and tasted of copper. Zola, Cora, and Hester Marrow stood in a triangle of silent agony. Because Alistair had spent the last 3 nights in a fever of nymphomaniac obsession, the room was filled with the remnants of his presence: discarded silk, spilled wine, and the cloying scent of black candles. They could hear the fight upstairs. They could hear the boom of Gwendolyn's voice and the pathetic, high-pitched shrieks of Alistair. Hester, the newest addition, was in the worst state. Her spirit was still fighting the tether. Her T-Bon Ange was screaming, clawing at the red clay doll in the trunk upstairs. She wanted to move. She wanted to reach out and touch Zola's hand. "Sister," her mind whispered into the void. "Sister, can you hear me?" Zola's consciousness flickered. She had been in the dark the longest. Her world was a series of sensations: the cold stone under her feet, the weight of the silver needles in her shadow, and the terrifying, wet heat of Alistair's touch when he descended. "I hear you," Zola's spirit replied. It wasn't a sound, it was a vibration in the magic that bound them. "Don't fight it, Hester. The more you fight, the more it hurts. He likes the fight. He drinks it." "We have to kill him," Cora's voice joined the chorus, a sharp, jagged edge of pure hatred. "We have to break the dolls." "We have no hands, Cora," Zola replied. "We are just eyes. Eyes that see the devil." Suddenly, the trapdoor at the top of the cellar stairs creaked open. A sliver of light cut through the red silk like a blade. But it wasn't the small, shuffling footsteps of Alistair. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of Gwendolyn's boots. The 3 sisters watched as the tall mistress descended into their hell. She held a brass lamp high, the yellow light revealing the horror of Alistair's gallery. She saw the red silk. She saw the candles. And then she saw the women. Gwendolyn stopped. She didn't cry out. She didn't rush to free them. She walked a slow circle around the 3 sisters, her face a mask of cold, aristocratic disgust. She looked at Zola's frozen tears. She looked at Hester's terrified, wide-eyed stare. "So," Gwendolyn whispered, her voice echoing in the vault, "this is where he spends my money. This is where he hides his shame." She reached out and touched Zola's shoulder. It wasn't a touch of comfort. It was the touch of an owner inspecting damaged goods. "You're spoiled," Gwendolyn said, her voice devoid of empathy. "The voodoo has rotted you. He has touched you. He has turned my house into a brothel for ghosts." Upstairs, they heard Alistair screaming as he scrambled for the trunk. But Gwendolyn didn't move. She looked at the sisters, and for a fleeting second, Zola saw something in the mistress's eyes that was more terrifying than Alistair's nymphomania. She saw a total, clinical absence of humanity. "I cannot have spoiled fruit in my garden," Gwendolyn said, "and I cannot have a master who plays with dolls." She turned and began to walk back up the stairs, leaving the lamp on the floor. "Wait!" Zola's mind screamed. "Help us!" But the trapdoor slammed shut. The bolt slid home, and from the room above, the sisters heard the sound of heavy furniture being dragged across the wood, blocking the only way out. The small master is trapped in his study. The tall mistress has seen the rot. And in the cellar, the Marrow sisters are no longer victims. They are evidence. And Gwendolyn Sterling has never liked a witness. Chapter 10. The Alchemist of Despair. Inside the locked study, the air was vibrating with Alistair Sterling's panic. He had heard the trapdoor slam. He had heard the heavy oak wardrobe being dragged across the floorboards, sealing the cellar and his collection away from him. He was a king who had lost his kingdom, a nymphomaniac whose supply of silence had been cut off by a woman who refused to be silenced. "Think, Alistair, think," he hissed to himself, his small hands tearing through the silver-lined trunk. The binding salt was gone. The commanding dust had failed against the sheer, iron will of Gwendolen. He realized now that the Borgney had been right. A small man playing with souls is like a child playing with a landslide. But Alistair wasn't ready to be buried. He pulled out a hidden compartment at the bottom of the trunk. Inside was a single obsidian needle wrapped in a scrap of Gwendolen's stolen nightdress. This was the great graft, the ritual he had been too afraid to use. It didn't just bind a soul, it attempted to swap them. He wanted to put his consciousness into Gwendolen's 6'1" frame and leave her spirit trapped in his own frail, trembling body. He began the chant, his voice cracking. He pricked his own thumb, letting the blood drip onto the obsidian needle. By the root and the rot, by the swamp and the salt, change the skin, change the sin. But the house was already shouting over him. He heard the heavy footsteps of Gwendolen returning from the kitchen. She wasn't alone. He heard the clanking of metal buckets and the sloshing of liquid. The smell hit him through the floorboards, not the sweet jasmine of the bayou, but the sharp, acrid, bone-burning scent of boiling lye. "No," Alistair whispered, the needle slipping from his fingers. "Not the marrows, she wouldn't." But he knew Gwendolen. She didn't believe in mercy, she believed in purity. And to Gwendolen Sterling, a house with a secret was a house that was already dead. Chapter 11. The Lie and the Lace. Gwendolen Sterling stood over the trapdoor in the great hall. She had changed her dress. She now wore a stiff, high-collared gown of gray silk, as if she were attending a funeral or a coronation. Behind her stood two of the house servants, their faces masks of paralyzed terror. They held a massive iron vat between them, the liquid inside bubbling and hissing, sending up clouds of white, corrosive steam. "Open it," Gwendolen commanded. "Mistress, please," one of the men stammered. "The girls, they're still down there. We can see 'em standing." "They are no longer girls," Gwendolen said, her voice as cold as the deep-sea floor. "They are evidence of a sickness. They are the stains my husband left on the Sterling name, and I will not sleep in a house that smells of his animal urges." She kicked the wardrobe aside herself, her strength bolstered by a towering, righteous fury. She pulled the trapdoor open. Below, in the red silk dark, the Marrow sisters looked up. Zola, Cora, and Hester saw the giantess silhouetted against the chandelier light. They saw the vat of steaming lye. They were still frozen by Alistair's magic, unable to scream, unable to plead. They could only watch as their mistress, their rescuer, prepared to erase them from existence. Zola's spirit clawed at the walls of her own mind. "Run!" she screamed internally. "Run, sisters!" But their feet were rooted in the salt. Their shadows were sewn to the floor. "Alistair!" Gwendolen shouted, her voice echoing into the study where her husband cowered. "Watch! Watch how I clean the mess you made." She tipped the vat. The liquid didn't fall like water. It fell like a curtain of white fire. It hit the red silk hangings first, the fabric dissolving in an instant. Then it hit the stone. And then it hit the sisters. The horror was silent. Because the voodoo curse held their vocal cords in a vice, the screams stayed inside their throats. But their eyes were a symphony of agony. Zola watched as the skin on Cora's arms began to bubble and peel away. She felt the searing, liquid heat touch her own feet, the lye eating through her shoes and into her bone. Gwendolen watched with a clinical, detached interest. "See how the magic dissolves, Alistair. See how the still life turns to nothing but gray sludge." Chapter 12. The last breath of Iron-Rose. The study door burst open. Alistair Sterling didn't come out as a man. He came out as a cornered rat. He lunged at Gwendolen, the obsidian needle raised high, his face a mask of nymphomaniac grief and occult madness. "You killed them," he shrieked. "You killed my masterpieces." Gwendolen didn't even flinch. She caught his wrist midair, her grip so strong that the bone in Alistair's forearm snapped with a sound like a dry twig. The needle fell, clattering into the steaming pit of lye below. She looked down at him, her 6'1" frame making him look like a broken toy. "You never understood the land, Alistair," she whispered, her face inches from his. "You thought you could own it with needles and salt, but the land only belongs to those who are strong enough to burn what they love." She didn't use a knife. She didn't use a gun. She gripped him by the collar and the belt and threw him. Alistair Sterling didn't have time to scream. He hit the floor of the cellar, landing in the pool of boiling lye at Zola Marrow's feet. For one final, terrifying second, their eyes met. Zola melting into a statue of gray bone, and Alistair, the man who had stolen her soul, dissolving in the very liquid Gwendolen had used to cleanse his sins. Zola felt the magic break. As the lye ate the red clay dolls in the silver trunk upstairs, the tether snapped. For the first time in months, Zola Marrow could move. She reached out. With the last of her strength, as her fingers turned to ash, she didn't try to climb out. She reached down. She wrapped her melting hand around Alistair's throat and pulled him deep into the boiling white fog with her. If she was going to hell, she was taking her master with her. Upstairs, Gwendolen Sterling stood at the edge of the pit. She watched until the bubbling stopped. She watched until the red silk was gone and only the gray stone remained. She turned to the servants. "Burn the house," she said calmly. "Tell the town the voodoo doctors from the swamp came in the night. Tell them they took the master and the girls, and they set the fires to hide their tracks." She walked out of the manor, her lace collar pristine, her shadow long and straight in the rising sun. Behind her, the Iron-Rose began to scream in flames. The fire burned for 3 days. They say the lye and the salt fused the bones of the Marrows and the Sterlings into a single, twisted mass of white stone. Gwendolen Sterling moved to Savannah, a wealthy widow who never spoke of her husband again. But in the low country, when the moon is thin, they say you can still see a small man running through the moss, pursued by a giantess who carries a vat of white fire. The Marrow collection is closed, but the debt is never truly paid.